Lovely to be with you. Didn't have to travel far from Georgia Tech. I direct the Urban Climate Lab. We partner with cities all over the country, sometimes out of the country, on climate adaptation issues. I have given climate talks before. This is the first time I give a climate talk in the cone of a hurricane. Approaching. And so I think this is going to be a very attentive audience. And so I appreciate it. We have kind of adjusted our schedule a bit, so I'm going to move at a pace so we have enough time for the panel. Hurricane Helene that is heading towards us is the 8th named storm of the 2024 hurricane season. The second storm was Beryl. And Beryl came out of the Gulf, roared into southern Texas, into Houston. And by several hours of rainfall and flooding and the kinds of things we come to expect from a hurricane, many people lost their power. You're probably going to see something like that play out in the next 24 hours in Atlanta. What was different, we hope, between Beryl and Helene was that as soon as the tropical storm remnants moved through Houston, the heat came back. And so they saw temperatures of mid to high 90s with no power. A large number of families with no power. And so that is about the most threatening set of circumstances we can imagine with climate change. And so we don't know how many people might have gotten ill from the heat or died from the heat during Hurricane Beryl in Houston. It's estimated to be quite large. We know from other events of combined blackouts and heat that the death toll can be very significant. And so this is from an event in the Pacific Northwest, 2021. If you remember this, in Washington State, you can see in a single week the number of additional deaths exceeded the peak of the COVID epidemic. And so heat is a very significant health threat of climate change. And I'm emphasizing it because it is the threat that we most confront in Atlanta. We know that every year the number of people who die or go to the emergency department from heat is many times greater than all other forms of extreme weather combined. So you can see hurricanes, tornadoes, relatively small number of fatalities compared to heat. So heat is invisible to us, and we're often not very aware of it. So what is driving heat in cities like Atlanta? The global greenhouse effect is, of course, raising temperatures across the entire planet from our emissions of carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases. That's set in the background for cities. But within cities, we have an additional phenomenon known as the urban heat island effect, and that comes from the development process itself. So clearing the land of vegetation, the land context has trees, that heats things up. When we pave over that landscape with our parking lots and buildings and homes, that heats things up further, more heat retained. Waste heat from our vehicles, we're not only emitting greenhouse gases, we're emitting a tremendous amount of heat, and that heat warms the city. And then the more solid the design of the city, these downtown districts trap heat. And so when we look at what cities are warming most rapidly around the country, Atlanta's number three. And so Atlanta is warming at about 3 times the rate of the planet as a whole. And so that combination of the global greenhouse effect, that background warming, and the urban heat effect is really amplifying temperatures in cities like Atlanta. So again, Atlanta ranks among the most rapidly warming cities on Earth. If you live in a city, you are in many respects on the front lines of climate change. If you live in Atlanta, you are very much on the front lines of climate change and probably don't even know it. One of the core purposes of the Urban Climate Lab in Georgia Tech is to map heat and flood risk at the neighborhood level. So we can see what is the level of risk we confront where we live. This is from a recent summer, showing you on a hot day the distribution of temperatures, of air temperatures around downtown and in-town neighborhoods. And then on the right we have what we're about to see play out is stormwater runoff, the amount of rainwater that's running off of the built environment and creating a flooding effect in these neighborhoods. We know there is a disparity of vulnerability in Atlanta, and it maps with historical bias and disparities that we trace in many respects to disinvestment from redlining. And so we have a pronounced legacy of this disinvestment, and it continues today even though the lending practices have largely changed. So if we look at the top 10 most vulnerable neighborhoods in Atlanta for heat and flood risk, most of them are concentrated in these red line neighborhoods, and so that's not surprising. But we also see great vulnerability in other areas where we might not expect it. Buckhead Village, Lenox, these are highly impervious areas where we actually have lots of climate risk. So historic bias is strongly predictive of present vulnerability, and that directs us to where we should be focusing our efforts. So what can we do? We can do a lot of things. I don't have time to highlight the things we can do, but Atlanta has a lot of control over heat risk in particular. This is looking again at this distribution of heat in the present day with our present tree canopy, for example. What if we were to increase our tree canopy? We have many neighborhoods that more than 50%, 60% of the places where we can put trees have trees. If we did that in all of our neighborhoods, we could really cool things down. Now, tree planting isn't appropriate in all places where we can put them, and so, but this is one of the strategies we have available to us. And what we see, the good news is it makes a real impact. This is neighborhood by neighborhood from the neighborhoods you can see in the map. What it would mean in terms of heat-related mortality in a single summer. If we lose more trees, 10%, you're going to see heat-related mortality go up in every neighborhood. If we increase tree canopy, particularly in a lot of the neighborhoods I've featured here, we can see a reduction of 30%, 40%, in some cases 50%. That's very empowering for us. Last Friday was Parking Day. How many people knew that was Parking Day? Anybody celebrate Parking Day? Okay. You have to go to school of urban planning to appreciate Parking Day. For sure. But our students in the school city in Georgia Tech, they go out and they occupy a parking space, just one parking space. And they're honoring something that happened in 2005 in the Mission District in San Francisco, where a group of young urban planner activist types decided to carry out an experiment. They didn't tell the city. They occupied one parking space to protest how much of the Mission District is set aside for cars. About 50%. It's like that in downtown Atlanta too. Streets, parking lots, it's about 50%. That's a lot of the public realm that we've given over to cars. And so they rolled out some grass, they brought in a tree, they used some Home Depot, I want to plug the local garden center, but they put a bench in it, and they went across the street and they just watched what would happen. Within a few minutes, somebody came and sat down on the bench, started reading paper. A few minutes later, somebody else came and sat under the tree in this little mini park. And then to the great delight of the students observing, they started to have a conversation. Two strangers started having a conversation. And so this became a very powerful idea we saw in the pandemic. New York today has more than 50 linear miles of what they call streeteries and parklets, bringing green space, dining space into the city. So I think there's a nugget here of a direction, even for thinking about climate change, that we can pursue in Atlanta and that we are pursuing. Imagine if we took some of our underutilized spaces in Atlanta and converted it into an alternative mode of transportation for people who want it, a linear park, a tree planting, a wildflower meadow. What would that do to heat and flooding? It actually has a tremendous benefit for us. Imagine if we took a no longer used parking lot that's generating runoff and contributing to flooding and heat every day and converted it to an affordable housing project. And we put solar panels on the roof, as we were just hearing about from Rob. And we reduce the cost of housing, the cost of energy. We include backup power. We have more resilience. How would that play out if we did that across Atlanta? What if we went to one of the most flood-prone neighborhoods in the city and put in a large stormwater facility that was also a fantastic green space, as we've done in Vine City recently? What if we employed our youth to help plant trees, to help invest in renewable energy projects, park projects? How beneficial would that be for the city? And what if we have resilience hubs? We were just hearing about this. Our first resilience hub at a church, community church, on the west side, to provide greater resilience for the community. Key message I'm concluding with here aligns with what Mayor Dickens is saying in his vision for the city. safe, healthy, connected neighborhoods with an expansive culture of equity, empowering upward mobility, embracing youth development, innovative, dependable government. This is his vision for the city. I would say this is very aligned with what we need for climate adaptation. If we think about climate adaptation as an additional obligation that doesn't have other things we want and need in cities, we will not be successful. These things are aligned. And so with this, I will turn it over to our panel to discuss what their organizations are focused on and how this aligns with the larger goals of climate change. So why don't we just have a second, have each of you introduce who you are, and then we'll start with you, Reverend Ursley. You want to say, just introduce yourself briefly, and then if you can comment on how the organizations you are working with are focused on the climate change challenge and how that aligns with your long-term work in Atlanta, which has been so important.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Gerald Durley. I work in the area. I was so glad to see my good friend. I started with Dr. King in 1959. Involved with civil rights and human rights and all of that. And so for all of those years, we fought that there were constitutional rights for everybody to have in terms of voting, in terms of housing, health care, and all of this. So we spent most of our time in the 60s fighting for those kinds of, we thought those kinds of issues that were so germane to just human dignity and human life. But then about 15 years ago, in years past, and 15 years ago, I met a young lady. Now, I could have cared less about a polar bear that couldn't make it to the glaciers melting, the climate change, all of these things. They were so foreign because in our community, we dealt with police brutality, we dealt with teenage pregnancy, we dealt with health care. So for the last 15 or so years, I've been combining civil rights, human rights, along with the environmental rights. It's an environmental justice right for everybody to have clean energy, clean water. So I got involved with, and this young lady who was convincing me, you just need to talk to somebody. I said, lady, I don't have time to do that. But since it was Jane Fonda, I said I'd talk to her. And so she introduced me to her husband and Sally Bingham, and got involved with the Interfaith Power and Light. So for the last 7 years, I'm chair of the board, chair emeritus of the board of climate change of Interfaith Power and Light. And I'm here in Atlanta. I was Dean at Clark, and then I pastored 25 years at Morehouse. And everybody says, now you claim to fame. 18 years ago, I installed a little guy over at Ebenezer called Raphael Warnock. And, but so now, in particular in the African American community, how do we now begin to look at the injustices for those who pollute the least, but are destroyed the most in terms of everything? So that's pretty much what I'm involved with right now.
Great. Cody, you want to?
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Cody Nord. I serve as Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. So just really quickly, we work across the entire state of Georgia to organize and equip faith communities and people of faith to, one, organize in their communities, do education, both theological and practical, on how you can deal with these issues on climate. We do practical implementation, so everything that you can do on site at a congregation to do anything around the environment. We do energy efficiency, rooftop solar implementations, EV charging stations, land use, tree plantings, building resiliency hubs, and then advocating at the local, state, and federal level on policy issues. And what I would say, what I like is how much land you pointed out that the city has. And something that we like to talk about is there's 15,000 houses of worship in Georgia. So when you think about the amount of energy, water, land, and people that is, it's quite significant. So we're having a lot of macro conversations around democracy and what policies can be put into place to make change. But ultimately, we believe that congregations are a place that can make this change no matter what and demonstrate what's possible in their community. So our job is to hear your ideas on what you want to do at your congregation. What I would say is, if you just care about climate, that's all you have to do, and then come and talk to us and we'll figure out how to make it work. You don't have to know how to make it work. Our job is to try to figure out how to make it work for you.
Great, thank you. My name is Gil Rogers. I'm the director of the Georgia office of the Southern Environmental Law Center. We are a nonprofit legal organization that works in 6 southeastern states, including Georgia. And we provide the full range of legal advocacy and legal services. So at any given time, maybe 40% of our docket is actually going to court. Most of what we do is collaborative. So we work with local governments, we work at the state level, at the federal level, and in all branches of government to advocate for protection of natural resources and promotion of healthy communities. And the South is, I think, very uniquely positioned as a region in terms of climate change, both because of it has almost an outsized footprint in terms of what we're putting into the air that's contributing to climate change. And we also have a tremendous opportunity to do something about it because we are on the front lines for a lot of the effects that spring from climate change. So we're seeing that a lot right now, for example, on the Georgia coast, with pushing to protect marshlands and wetlands down in that area, which serve as natural buffers against these increased storm impacts, increased flood risks. We're doing things like promoting development in certain areas, but staying away from areas that are going to be inundated by climate change impacts. And we're doing work with local governments like Atlanta Regional Commission to try to make sure that we're maximizing the federal incentives that are coming down from the Inflation Reduction Act and also from the Infrastructure Act to make sure that these local governments are getting all the resources that are available to improve and make themselves more resilient against these impacts. And there are a lot of federal and state laws that are on the books already that are actually put Georgia in a pretty favorable place. They're not always enforced as much as they should be, and some of that is our job as legal experts to go and do that to protect waterways, marshes, things like that, and also to promote clean energy. We do a lot of work with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light and the other Interfaith Power and Light chapters around the South. Great partners in promoting renewable energy and weaning us off of the fossil fuels that have largely contributed to this crisis.
So the Southeast has more coastline than any other region of the country. And I highlighted that we have a pretty extreme heat risk in Atlanta. And so Atlanta and the Southeast have real climate vulnerabilities. I wonder, through each of your organizations and your work, what are our unique advantages in Atlanta? I mean, Cody, you were talking about, and I highlighted that we have a fair amount of space to work with. Are there other unique advantages that we have in Atlanta to respond to what is a pretty heightened challenge around climate change? You have a thought?
Let me try to think about how I'll answer that question. I think the benefit of Atlanta, quite honestly, is its history and its people. I think when you look across the Southeast, you say this, that if you want to, turn the country, then you turn the South, and you can make that happen. I think when you're looking across the Southeast at states that can make that possible, Georgia is one of the only states that can make that possible. And I think in a divided political environment, Georgia also has the kinds of cities and communities that, despite what national or state government might look like, there's still quite a good bit of local opportunity to make real change. It's why we haven't had the ability to pass 100% clean energy plans statewide, but there are tons of cities who are passing them and putting them into place. And I think similarly, that also points towards a model that denominations and congregations can do, which is you don't have to wait, you can make those commitments and put them into place. Atlanta's doing that right now, Savannah's doing that. So I think a history of really diverse cities with also giving themselves the authority to make change locally where they are without waiting on anybody.
And I think it's key when you talk about the organizations before, is that Interfaith Power and Light. We talk about climate change. It doesn't really register to people. Just the heat, we see the heat going up, but it doesn't register until it really gets into your gut. So we, Interfaith Power and Light, we're in 40 states, 22,000 houses, Muslims, Christians, Jews. And we use the theological perspective to understand that we were given a perfectly balanced ecological world. And in there, we took it for granted and we destroyed it at its core. So we try to come back and get from a theological point of view. This is a spiritual awakening group. I think that was on the label of the title or something, spiritual. And so you got to go back to understanding that, because in our community, particularly in the African American community, where we suffer the most because of toxic waste dumps, because of the heat in the urban areas, is that, but when you start trying to talk to people about that, they say, wait a minute, we've got to look at this, we've got to look at the disparity here, all of the disparities. So by coming together, we began to look across line. The Muslims are suffering, the Jewish community, the other communities, and when we can all take our various theological perspectives and put them, and we find out that we're saying really the same thing. And when we come together, then we can have the impact to move to, not just stand in that theological, but also move into the legislative, because we realize when we got to, as we say, what are we willing to sacrifice? What are we willing to risk? Are we ready to speak truth to power? So when we go up there, we not only go with the information that you gave and the other panelists, we go with the spiritual unctioning that there is a God that holds us in the palm of his mighty hand. And if you follow that we're in an ethical and a moral warfare against some people that were power, capitalism over people. So we have an ethical and moral responsibility. So we try to put that in there so that when we move and we go up on Capitol Hill, we can speak, but we have a mandate, not only for saving humanity, but certainly for saving the environment and the animals and the plants and all of that. So I think that that's what's so critical that we try to do, to put it into people's, first of all, put it in people's minds, because it's already in their gut.
I'll just give a couple of examples. That's an important question. It's a lot of ways to look at it. My primary background in my career has been water, and so that obviously has a lot to do with climate change in terms of increased drought. I think I've lived in Atlanta since 2002. I think Georgia has had 4 or 5 droughts of record in that time span, which are supposed to come maybe once every 100 years. So we're clearly worried about flooding today, but just the different ways that we're receiving water means that we have to really pay attention to our infrastructure, our sewer infrastructure, our stormwater infrastructure. Thankfully, we've had great leaders in the past, like Mayor Franklin, who's really made fixing the sewers kind of one of her marquee issues. We need to continue that kind of pattern of leadership. This is a constant problem where we have sewer pipes that are over 100 years old. We have DeKalb County, for just to take one example, is under a court order to fix its sewers that's several decades old now. So these are problems that the Clean Water Act was passed to fix 50 years ago, and we're still facing them. And they're only going to become more acute as we deal with climate change and the way that water falls onto Atlanta and the rest of Georgia. So that's an important piece of the puzzle. I think statewide, we've had some visionary leadership in the past on stewardship of natural resources. We have a state Coastal Marshlands Protection Act in play that none of our other states have. And largely as a result of that, we have the most intact marsh ecosystem in the entire eastern seaboard. And that's going to position our coastal populations very well to absorb the impacts of climate change. But we've got to make sure that we continue to protect those and prioritize protection of those resources over development pressure.
One of the, I would observe that one of the assets we have in Atlanta are, investments we've already made that we don't think of as climate adaptation. And so I put up the Rodney Cook Stormwater Park, which is a beautiful facility. If you haven't seen it, I would go see it. Like the historic Fourth Ward Stormwater Park. Atlanta, as far as I can tell, is the first city in the world to invest in these kinds of parks, in these floodable spaces. We have a very famous floodable space in the Netherlands. It was built years after we first invested in this kind of infrastructure. And so that's unique and worth celebrating. But we're also putting this infrastructure in some of the communities where it is most critical, our most vulnerable areas. You typically don't see that in this image. Usually the big adaptation investments are in more affluent areas of the city. That has been true in Atlanta. And then we also have kind of our flagship project for the City of the Beltline, which, the power of the Beltline is a green space project, of course, maybe a transit project, we're having arguments about that. It's a development project, but it's a project that is in every quadrant of the inner city. And that really makes it a powerful example of putting the investment equally around the city that you can. Atlanta has a long track record of actually doing that in a pretty successful way. So I think it's a part of our diversity, it's a part of our leadership. We do still have a city that has lots of growth and change ahead of it, and that's an opportunity to make the right kind of investments as we move forward. So I think there are a lot of positive things happening. And so I want to at least highlight that as part of the theme of what we're doing. I'm not sure where we are with
I
time.
wondered if, can I follow up on
Yeah,
that?
please go ahead. Yeah.
I was on the original Beltline board, and when you talk about that 22-mile circumference that we talked about,
Yeah.
and one of my roles was because it was coming through much of the African American community, and we were fighting that particular thing. We talk about progression, we organize, strategize, and mobilize. And so we were talking about that there would not be that much displacement, but we said property rights would go up and all of this. And so we had to go around and talk to different people, different segments of it to show that it would not, no one, first of all, would be displaced where would they have to go. I'm talking about in anything, whether it's climate change, working with those who are in communities who don't understand, who don't have like Cancer Row down there in Louisiana, they don't have enough money to fight the major petroleum company. So when the Beltline came in, that was a major issue, that would people be displaced? How would it improve the environment, the trees coming? So we slowly started talking through that. And the beauty in that now is that when I look at my grandchildren are on the Beltline now, my children are on the Beltline, and in those areas. Yes, the property values did go up, no doubt about that, but so did gentrification. In the city, everything went up. But the beauty is that it gave the opportunity to begin to understand. And where churches were concerned, we started moving toward organic gardens and talk about organic gardens, and we could tie it into exercise. So a comprehensive approach to not only the health and getting out into the environment, but also that the Beltline was a major part of that, and it's proven to be beneficial even now.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of fear,
For sure.
and
Yeah.
ignorance
For
and
good
fear.
reason.
Yeah,
Yeah.
ignorance and fear.
Yep. Okay, any questions from the audience?
No questions.
No questions from the audience?
Well, you can say it, the neighborhood structure.
That we have effective neighborhood structure through our NPU system. Is that what your neighborhood planning
The
system?
potential for resilient hubs and all that.
We have a potential for resilient hubs. through our NPU system.
And that's